Good morning. My name is Tim Finkley, and I am the Special Assistant to the President here at CAEP. We welcome you to the fall CAEPCon, and we hope everyone is doing well during this hectic time in our country. We have an amazing event for you and three amazing speakers. The first speaker will be Dr. Christopher Cook. He is the CAEP President, and he'll be giving the CAEP update. Our next speaker is Dr. Karen Gallagher-Sims, and she's our board chair, and she's going to be announcing the Frank Murray Award winners. And finally, our Vice President of Accreditation, Dr. Melina Monaco, she's going to be giving an update on the standards of living that occurred this year. We'd like to thank our sponsor, ETS, for sponsoring this event, and we hope everyone enjoys the fall CAEPCon, and we wish we could be in person with you. I'm going to kick it off and pass it to Christopher Cook.
Thank you for joining us today, and thank you for your leadership and your work during this difficult time in our history. I want to provide you some updates regarding CAEP. CAEP currently accredits 341 providers in 45 states, the District of Columbia, and Puerto Rico. And we have conducted our first reviews this past year in California and Hawaii. We have maintained 33 state agreements and 12 agreements with our specialized professional association partners. Like many of you, we have moved much of our work online, and we've evaluated all of our online reviews, receiving much positive feedback. This has also resulted in a cost savings for providers for the year of their review, an average of 20% reduction in cost. We're conducting all of our training of our volunteers and accreditation counselors online, and we've improved case management, now averaging 10 days early for all deadlines within the accreditation process. Further, we're now conducting regular meetings between our providers as you go through the process so that you can learn from your peers and see best practices. And finally, we've maintained our recognition from the Council for Higher Ed Accreditation, having submitted most recently in July of this past year. Further, we've submitted initial materials in April for recognition from the U.S. Department of Education. Again, thank you for your work in preparing our nation's teachers and administrators. I wish you all the best.
Next, we'll have Dr. Karen Gallagher-Sims, and she'll be announcing the winners of the Frank B. Murray Award.
Thank you, Tim. I'm delighted to be with you on this occasion to represent the CAEP Board of Directors. This has been a year of change and a year of challenges. My fellow board members and I want to acknowledge the challenges that you all had to face this year. No one could have predicted a year ago that in March, much of the education system as we know it would shut down and have to reboot. Like the rest of America, CAEP had to figure out ways to carry on our work as we sheltered in place. We had to figure out new ways to collect data and provide clinical partnerships. Many of us were already familiar with virtual classrooms, but if we weren't, we simply had to get up to speed. The CAEP staff and volunteers continued our work with virtual reviews. The Accreditation Council met virtually, and our board meetings have had to be held virtually as well. We know this is a difficult time for everyone, and we want to thank you for your continued efforts. As we have fought the pernicious effects of the pandemic, our nation has also engaged in a year of societal debate. We must commit to continuing work so that all people are treated equally. CAEP's Equity and Diversity Committee has worked along with our research committee to ensure the work we do at CAEP promotes inclusion, diversity, and equity. We're committed to advancing equity and excellence in educator preparation for the betterment of all K-12 students. CAEP has accredited 341 providers as of now. Of those, nearly 1/3 are historically Black colleges or universities, Hispanic serving institutions, or tribal colleges. We all know the CAEP standards are the gold standards for educator preparation. Through our standards, we support equity, diversity, and inclusion by emphasizing recruitment, selectivity, and support for diverse candidates so that all candidates will be prepared to successfully teach all students. In these difficult times, the CAEP board and I thank you for all you do to prepare candidates to make a positive difference in the lives of our children and youth. Last year, we introduced the Frank Murray Leadership Recognition. Frank Murray played an important role in the field of teacher education. He was the founding president of TEAC and served as chairman of its board. He was also the founding member of the CAEP Board of Directors and a major driver to consolidate educator preparation under one set of standards for the betterment of the field. We developed the Frank Murray Leadership Recognition for continuous improvement as a way to remember his legacy. And now I would like to introduce to you the Frank Murray class of 2020. Alma College, Michigan, Monmouth University, New Jersey, South Carolina State University, the University of Oklahoma, York College City University of New York, Bellarmine University, Kentucky, Northeastern Illinois University, Southern Illinois University at Carbondale, and West Virginia University at Parkersburg. Congratulations to all the recipients of this Frank Murray Leadership Recognition. These 9 EPPs represent the diversity and innovation that comes with CAEP accreditation. They reflect the creativity that CAEP affords in achieving excellence by meeting the standards in a variety of ways for the diverse populations they serve. Again, congratulations on this really important achievement.
We'll have Vice President of Accreditation, Dr. Melina Monaco, and she'll be doing an update on the standards revision that occurred this year.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. I hope you are all doing well. I'm Melina Monaco, the Vice President of Accreditation at CAEP, and I miss seeing everyone at CAEPCon, and we are making the best of our new normal. And so today I wanted to talk about a few items that folks had asked questions about: virtual visits, data gaps, and the revised standards. So I'm going to start with virtual visits. So in spring of 20, when COVID really shut down higher ed and K-12, we had about 36 cases left to go through site visits. And of those 36, we had 22 choose to complete and go through a virtual visit. So this was new to us as well as the EPPs. And I think we did very well with documenting the process for EPPs and coming up with some best practices for hosting virtual visits. So in the fall, we have 51 visits coming up, and the majority of those are completely virtual. So over the summer, we had a conversation about seeing what was going on with the virus and hoping that we could make some plans for the fall and look at maybe a different model. And so our new normal is going to be either fully virtual meetings or modified, which means that the lead is on site and the team is virtual. And by setting meetings up this way, site visits up this way, we are able to plan for a virtual visit if the lead is in fact not able to attend in person. And so this way we have kind of a backup so that EPPs can continue to hold their dates and hold their site visits when they are scheduled and not have a disruption. So that was the original plan for fall, was that leads would be on site. And what we found was that things had not changed or had actually gotten a little worse in some areas. And EPPs were implementing fairly stringent requirements for people to be on campus, volunteers to be on campus, and site teams. And so we ran into some issues with EPPs. We also ran into issues with our reviewers coming either from areas that were hotbeds for COVID, or their own institutions or states were not allowing them to travel. And so the majority of those 51 for fall of 20 are totally virtual visits, and we are moving forward in that model. A virtual visit does have a cost reduction associated with it. So there are basically two sets of fees for a site visit, and one site visit fee is for the actual work of the reports and the process, and those fees stay the same. But the reduction comes in the expenses for travel, hotels, lodging, meals, etc. So we're seeing about a 20% reduction in the cost of the overall site visit, with our teams being virtual. We've evaluated the process with the 22 that went through in the spring, and also working on getting feedback from the fall visits as they occur. And from what we've gathered, there is an overwhelmingly positive feeling about this process moving forward, and I think that it's going to be something that we keep and that we continue to use. So in the spring of 2021, I know that people are asking sort of what are we doing moving forward after fall. My assumption is that we are going to continue with a modified model where the lead is on site and the rest of the team is virtual. And if that is not feasible, given where we are with the virus, then we will be doing offering virtual visits, fully virtual visits in the spring of 2021 as well. So we have a large number of cases in the spring. We have 108 cases. 54 of those cases are interim advanced reviews. And so their timeline is a bit different from March to August are those reviews. And their timelines and impact of COVID and issues with volunteers. So we are trying to get our team set for spring 21 and are working through full site visits first, and then we'll work on the interim advanced teams last, so that those full visits can commence and we can move forward with keeping timelines according to policy. We have had a few issues with volunteers dropping off teams, and part of that is because of illness. We've had a few of our reviewers that have either had COVID or had family members that had COVID, and that has been a little fluid movement with our volunteer pool. So we are keeping them in our thoughts and replacing them off of teams as quickly as we can as soon as they notify us of their illness. So be patient with us with volunteers. We are certainly working on making sure everybody is able to participate to their fullest. So I did want to mention a little bit about interim advanced visits. They start in the spring of 21. Like I mentioned, that we have 54 of those cases. And I'm the case manager for the interim advanced reviews. They are one-day virtual visits. Most advanced components are in phase-in. There's only a few components that are not in the phase-in plan. And they require one cycle of data or process for these components. And that is what was agreed upon earlier when they signed agreements to do interim advanced reviews. They're two-person teams, so there's a lead and then a reviewer, And then for our joint states, we have the option of a state person being added to the team. So the maximum number would be a 3-person team. And the minimum number would be 2. The process is the same. So in Ames, if you're doing an interim advanced review and you could look at your shell, it looks exactly the same as it does for a full visit. It's got a self-study, a formative component for your formative report, the addendum, the site visit report, and the rejoinder. So the process is exactly the same. So we didn't want to include a different process. So it should look very familiar. And the only difference is that the timeline is more compressed. So these visits occur within 1 semester. So all of these steps are occurring within the 1 semester framework. So there is smaller amounts of time between each of these steps. But again, most of the components are in phase-in, and EPPs are providing phase-in plans. And so the review is a little bit different than a full review. So I did want to touch and talk about data shifts, gaps, and disruptions. I know this is a big issue for many EPPs, and we've received many questions about this. And so I wanted to just sort of talk about some of the issues that we've seen and ways to, as an EPP, to address them. So we've seen certainly a difference in clinical practice. We've seen disruptions in the way clinical practices are offered and how they are assessed. And so I know in the spring, we had quite a few EPPs that were sort of mid-data cycle when their institutions closed or went online or students left campus. And so there was a pretty large clinical practice disruption that occurred. And so for spring of, for the previous spring, what we were asking is if that occurred, which it did for almost every EPP, that you document that process. So where were you in the process when it was disrupted? How did you address that disruption? And what was the next step for you in terms of those candidates that may not have had the assessment tool used or data collected? And then for a lot of EPPs, they thought, we'll get through spring, we'll make some pretty quick decisions about how to move forward, and then over the summer we will contemplate what we need to do in the fall. And so changes were also introduced in the fall. And so we had some EPPs that had an instrument in place. It was disrupted in the spring. They did some modifications to it over the summer so that it could be used perhaps in a virtual format or in a different format for the fall. And then even within that decision, there might have been changes. We've had several EPPs that went back to in-person classes, and then after a few weeks sent everybody home. And so again, we're seeing that disruption occur in the fall. And so, really documenting that process of what you did and making sure that you're documenting your instrumentation disruption as well. So these are issues related to 5.2. So there may not have been time between the spring and the fall to do, for example, additional validity or reliability work on an instrument that you'd already established reliability and validity on. And so you're using that new instrument with a plan to do some validity and reliability work in the future. So we're working with our site visit teams to be cognizant of those gaps and instrumentation disruptions, and be flexible with how data is reviewed for an EPP. So it's not that we are waiving any of our policy or standards, it's that we're being flexible in what's acceptable in terms of cycles of data. So for example, you may use and add an older cycle of data prior to the disruption, and then talk about what happened during the disruption. And so using that older data cycle as one of your cycles could complete your 3 cycles and talk about those trends. You can use partial data as a cycle. So for again in spring, if you had half of your candidates able to use a certain instrument and you have data on that, please report it. I call that asterisk data. So you put an asterisk by it, and then you explain why it's partially, why there's partial data and not a full complement of data. And then what you did with your other candidates, right? So you can document the ones that you did assessments on, but then also talk about what you did with the candidates that you didn't have an assessment on. How did you move them forward? How did they complete their requirements? What was the process for those? And then data from multiple instruments. This is becoming very common as well. So modifying existing instruments to fit a virtual format or an avatar format or some other process that is now different moving forward. And so again, documenting that for your review team so that they are clear and they have flexibility in accepting those alternative cycles to complete your 3 cycles. So just be aware of that. There are some data gaps. So there are probably some instruments that you were unable to provide data for fall and spring. And again, the context of those data gaps and what was used in that gap, really important for your team and for the Accreditation Council to understand the process. We've also had quite a few states that have waived policy that impact EPPs and their data collection. They also might impact process or requirements. So for a lot of states that have certain testing requirements or certain forms or templates that are to be used and data collected, those things may have been waived by the state. And so again, documenting that waiver process. What did the state do? What was an acceptable alternative? What were you doing in the meantime? This also includes, although it's not a state waiver, but it is EPP's changing grading policy. So I know in the spring there was quite a few EPPs that went to pass-fail, and that could impact GPA. And so again, document the percent of pass-fail and what pass means and how it's defined, and how you're using that for your candidates. So again, I think the context for your data is very critical in helping your review team and the Accreditation Council understand exactly what happened, what data you're providing, where there may be gaps or disruptions, and what you were doing about those gaps and disruptions in your analysis or your trend data. So just being flexible in terms of discussing that, and as much detail as possible is very helpful for teams. If you have questions about any of your data as you move forward, please contact the case manager or myself. Happy to answer questions about what to do with certain types of data, and we can give you some guidance on that moving forward. So I want to shift gears a little bit and talk about the revision of the standards, initial standards. If you know me, you know I like a flow chart or graphic, and so of course I had to make one for this. So we really CAEP used a process, a stakeholder-focused revision model for revising the standards. We really wanted as many voices as possible to provide us information and guidance on the revisions. And so the revision model starts and ends with our board. So the standards are actually board standards. And so they're the bookends of our process and our model. And they're also in the middle as well. So we rely on the board for approval of the revised standards and moving forward. So this process actually started quite a while ago. It started over a year ago. The board has some standing committees, and they have a diversity and equity committee and a research committee. And those committees began the work of reviewing the 300 or so cases that had gone through CAEP review, the accreditation process, and reviewed that data, sort of mined that data for areas that may need to be included in the revision. And so that was done by standard. And the Equity and Diversity Committee was looking at equity and diversity components within the standards and the crosscuts, and coming up with recommendations for kind of a framework for the revision process. So both of those board committees did quite a bit of work reviewing existing data, looking at the research base, and writing reports that could help frame the process. And then we had a task force. So a task force was convened of lots of stakeholder groups, and that particular group did the majority of the writing of the revisions of the standards and the rationales, and kind of hashed out all the details. And then it went through some additional stakeholder groups back to the board, and it's currently in this public comment box. So this revised standards are out for public comment, and I encourage you to please go to the CAEP website and participate in that public comment phase. Those public comments will then come back to the task force, and we will review them for any additional edits from those suggestions, and then the final revision of the standards will go to the board in December for approval. So because we're a stakeholder-focused model, I wanted to just highlight some of the stakeholder groups that we engaged with. All of these stakeholder groups were represented in our task force. So we had CAEP volunteers, which are our reviewers, site visit leads. The actual board is a volunteer group. They're a non-paid board, and the Accreditation Council. So all of our CAEP volunteers were represented on our task force. We had spring 2022 EPP representation, as well as other EPPs, but the focus was on spring 2022. That was the targeted implementation semester. And so we wanted to make sure that those EPPs had a voice in the process, since they would be the first group kind of using those revised standards moving forward. So we wanted them to be well aware of the process and be familiar with it. We have state partnerships. So we had all of our states that we have partnerships with. We had representation from those states. We have P12 teachers. So that was a really important voice to be heard on the task force. They had very interesting perspectives of standards and the components and different interpretations, and they were really helpful to think differently about those standards and components. And then we had lots of external groups as well. We had ATE, Branch Ed, SREB, and NEA membership on the task force, again, bringing a different perspective for us, and that was very helpful. And then currently it's out for the general public, so anybody can make comments from, it opened in September 16th, and it closes on November 2nd. So fairly long public comment period, and we've gotten quite a few really good comments and edits. And so I think that process is working very well. And again, I encourage you to participate. So I want to reiterate that the revisions to the standards were based on, were evidence-based and research-based. So the task force was given the board committee reports from Research and Equity and Diversity. And each of those reports included a literature review, foundational kind of pieces, and updated research to support those findings. And so that was one of the tripod of supports that the task force was given. They were also given the U.S. Department of Ed and CHIA guidelines. So we are CHIA recognized, and we needed to make sure that we included those guidelines and were following those in any revisions that we made. And then also we are applying for a U.S. Department of Ed recognition. And so we needed to make sure that any requirements within Department of Ed were also incorporated in the revised standards and addressed appropriately. So that we had that guidance going into the task force. And then we had evidence from the Accreditation Council decisions and analysis. So at the end of each Accreditation Council, each semester, the data on the AFIs and stipulations and where they are occurring in components is analyzed and triangulated back with data from site visits. So we're looking at all that data from the Accreditation Council and from the decision perspective. And so we had that data to look at as well. And then, of course, we had evidence from the field. So we had EPPs, reviewers, and leads who are always giving us comments and feedback from the 300 or so cases that we had completed at the time the task force met. And so those pieces of evidence were really critical because those were groups that had either participated in reviews or were the EPPs that were reviewed and had quite a bit of comments and feedback about process, but also where there was issues of maybe vagueness or issues of where there was too much specificity. And that was a real help for the task force to have that process defined by the field and the folks that had gone through. So our decisions weren't just made in a bubble. We had research and support for making those decisions. So I do want to emphasize that I'm talking about revisions and not new standards. So when people talk to me or email me or call me and they talk about the new standards, I always politely correct them, and it's the revised standards. So the task force went into this process looking for certain things. They were not looking to create new standards. They were not looking to add, new sort of requirements within that. They were looking at the standards as they were and where they could eliminate overlap and redundancy. So again, where the data had shown us from EPPs and reports, where there was an overlap or there was evidence being doubly tagged and comments about that they thought they'd already kind of answered this question in another standard or this issue, and it was asked again in a different way. And so we really looked at eliminating that overlap and that redundancy if possible. And the way we could do that was consolidating. So we looked at consolidating components. So if there were things that were able to be consolidated, we did that within the language of the revisions, and also clarifying the language. So where we saw data from the Accreditation Council, from reviewers, and from EPPs, where language was unclear or could be worded better, we spent quite a bit of our time working on clarifying language. And then, of course, updating language and terminology. So the original standards were done in 2012 and 13, and things have changed now in 2020. And so we wanted to make sure all of our language and terminology was up to date and that we were using the appropriate modern versions of terminology. And then we tried very hard to add flexibility where it was needed in certain places, and where the field was telling us that there were sort of maybe other options of doing or providing evidence for. And so we worked on flexibility generally in the areas where there was the most issue. So for example, old 3.2 and old 4.1 were always points at which there was some discussion about the possibility of flexibility with the changing of state data and testing requirements, et cetera. So really trying to add flexibility. And then one of the suggestions that came out of the equity, diversity, and inclusion group was that we really embed those crosscuts back into the components where they were most appropriate. And so the cross-cutting themes of technology and diversity, although were intended to be kind of holistic cross-cuts through all the standards, it was sometimes unclear about what evidence and process needed to be documented in that. And so it was much clearer if it was actually embedded within the components. And so quite a bit of work was done to embed that language back and those expectations back into components, so it was much clearer to the EPP when they were to address sort of technology issues, when they were to address equity and diversity, and how. And so I think that is one of the really great pieces of the revision is that language being put back. And then, of course, we had the U.S. Department of Ed requirements, and so we had to make sure that we were incorporating those as well in the process. So just a 50,000-foot view of the standards revision. So in standard one, we did quite a bit of work on clarifying language in the revised standards, and also we consolidated components from 5 components down to 4. And standard one, I think, was one of the standards that had the most ambiguity about some of the requirements and some of the redundancy. And so we worked really hard to clarify within each of the new order of the components to have them be intentional in their ordering and in their language. And so I think there is quite a bit of word change in standard 1. And then standard 2, we really didn't do a lot of change. The components stayed the same. There's still 3 components. We did clarify language. There was some extraneous language and we removed that. And we also added the references to virtual clinical practice. And so this is a timely feature. Many EPPs are struggling now with preparing their candidates to work in a virtual or hybrid model, and to add some of that experience into clinical experience was, I think, really critical, and the task force felt was an important addition to requirements in standard 2. And then standard 3, we actually did quite a bit of consolidation in standard 3. There was quite a bit of overlap with parts of standard 1, and also even within 3. And so we went from 6 components down to 3, and we added flexibility to the old 3.2. So if you look at the revised standards, you'll see that the old 3.2 is the revised 3.3, and we've added some flexibility in the testing process for that. So again, I encourage you to go to public comment and make comments on those components. That's very helpful for us to see how you are reviewing that. And then standard 4, again, we consolidated down from 4 components to 3 and added some flexibility in the old 4.1. So again, there wasn't a tremendous amount of change in 4, but certainly the flexibility with impact data was something that needed to be updated, and we did that as a task force. And then standard 5, we clarified language and we consolidated components from 5 down to 4. And I would mention that the reason that we renumbered the components is the task force felt it was really critical that we are intentional in the way that the flow of the components within each standard worked. And so, for example, in standard 5, you have 5.1, which is the quality assurance system. From that system, you get quality data, right? And that's 5.2. And from that data, you share that with stakeholders. That becomes 5.3. And that those stakeholders in partnership with you make evidence-based decisions and continuous improvement models. And so that's 5.4. And so we tried to reorder and be intentional in terms of the way that the components flowed, and that's why the renumbering occurred. All of the revised standards have the R before them, so you'll see R1.1, R4.1, and they don't always align to the old numbering system. So be aware of that when you're looking at the revised standards. And then there were several questions I wanted to address from the field. So these were questions that were presented to CAEP through the registration process for CAEPCon. And so I just wanted to touch base and answer them. I think I've answered quite a few in the presentation, but wanted to touch on these as well. So one was the revised standard is implementation plan, and that is for spring 2022. And again, that was chosen because the shells had not been released, and that was enough time, we thought, to offer the flexibility with the revised standards and include them in the process. And so that was selected as the semester to begin the revision process with the standards. And then we will have aligned resources. I'm calling it a workbook so we don't confuse it with the current handbook in our work to get that done. But there will be aligned resources to the revised standards, and they will be available in December when the revised standards are approved. So currently I have a separate task force working on the documentation for that workbook and working through what needs to be included. And we will be working through November to get that work done. So we have a draft and resources that are aligned to the revised standards moving forward. The advanced standards, there's been quite a few number of questions about advanced standard alignment, and we are currently aligning the advanced standards as well. So there are some connections between initial and advanced standards, like standard 5 is the same standard. And so we need to make sure that we align those, and so we are doing that currently. And we are a little farther behind the initial, because the initial was the big push, and sort of the lion's share of the work on the revisions was for initial. And so we are currently crosswalking the advanced standards. So where there are connections to the initials, we are making sure that that language is parallel in the advanced. There are not as many components in advanced, and there are not as many sort of issues to align. So I think the revision process will be much quicker for the advanced standards, and we hope to only be a semester behind in that review process. The self-study templates, a question about the templates. So for starting in spring of 22, those templates have been released and they are modified to address the revised standards as well as any of the requirements for U.S. Department of Ed. And so I wanted to make sure that that was clear. So the shells are aligned to the revised standards from spring 22 on. And then some webinars and workshops. So I just wanted to point, some people had asked in the questions about where there are webinars and will there be workshops. And so I wanted to point you to a few. We have interim advanced reviews. That is actually on our website. I did a webinar for that. So if you are in the interim advanced review process, that is something that you can go and review and watch. And then some planning, a virtual visit process. I think we can do a webinar for that. I'm meeting with all the spring 2022 EPPs. So I have met with them once to kind of go over the revised standards, and we'll be meeting with them again in November. And then in subsequent semesters, we'll be meeting twice a semester, again, to review the process and answer any questions as they go through using the revised standards. So we'll be meeting several times during the course of each semester. And then there's also some meetings scheduled for cohort semesters. And what I mean by that is all the EPPs going through in fall 21 or fall 22. So we're going to start to set up a few of those cohort meetings, and again, answer questions and let you know when shells are released, when there's resources, and answer any questions. And so I'll be hosting those as well throughout the course of each semester. And then I think we are working on, in the spring, some workshops that we normally would have done at CAEPCon. So writing the SSR, reliability and validity, and some other aspects that we do at CAEPCon. We will try and do a few webinars and working on our spring CAEPCon format and what we're going to provide. So those things are upcoming. And then I did want to remind everybody again that the revised standards are out for public comment. The deadline is November the 2nd. So please take some time and provide us some feedback. Your feedback's very important, and it's something that I'm reading every comment and trying to group them and theme them and address those within the revisions of the standards. So just to be aware that that's still ongoing and you have a few more weeks to think about and review the revised standards and provide us comments. So very important that you do that. And then, of course, I'm available for questions. My email's at the bottom. Most of you know my email, but feel free to contact me with any questions, or anybody else at CAEP that you are familiar with and would like to reach out to. We want to make sure that your questions are answered and that we are doing the best we can to clear up any ambiguity that you may have in this time about virtual visits or data or your review process. So again, thank you so much for attending the session and coming to Fall CAEPCon, and I hope to see all of you in person soon. So everybody stay healthy and have a good afternoon. Thank you.